For most of us, walking into a funeral comes with a highly specific set of ingrained expectations.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It is a deeply entrenched cultural script.
Right. Like you put on the dark clothes, you brace yourself for that really heavy atmosphere.
And usually, you are walking into a room just full of ornate floral arrangements.
Yes, and listening to those open mic eulogies where friends get up and share, like, chronological anecdotes about the person.
Or watching a slideshow of the person's life playing in the background while sad music plays.
Exactly. We were just so deeply accustomed to ceremonies that act as a retrospective, like an emotional backward glance at the life that was lived.
Well, that retrospective approach is so common it feels universal, We basically treat a funeral as the definitive closing chapter of a book.
Right.
The entire structure of a traditional funeral is designed to summarize the person, almost like wrapping up their legacy so the living can find closure in the past.
But what happens when a community fundamentally disagrees with the premise that death is a final closing chapter?
I mean, that changes the architecture of the entire grieving process.
And that is exactly what we are jumping into today. We are looking at a profoundly different approach to honoring someone who has passed, the Jehovah's Witness funeral service.
It really is fascinating.
It is a tradition that completely upends those standard expectations. Instead of a heavy retrospective, it shifts the focus entirely toward scripture, profound simplicity, and a very specific future-oriented hope.
Yeah, it is a complete paradigm shift.
So whether you might be attending a service for a Jehovah's Witness colleague or friend, or you're simply fascinated by how different communities navigate the universal experience of grief, this deep dive is going to give you a clear, respectful look inside a highly structured tradition. Okay, let's unpack this.
I think the best place to start is with the core theological concept that drives everything else, which is the sheer, uncompromising focus on Scripture.
Right, because it's not about the person's resume.
Exactly. A Jehovah's Witness funeral service is built almost entirely around a structured, Bible-based discourse.
So there isn't a parade of family members coming up to the mic.
No, not at all. Rather than focusing on the past life of the deceased, the speaker, who is usually an elder or minister from the local congregation, delivers a talk that specifically explains what their faith refers to as the condition of the dead.
The condition of the dead. I mean, let's break that phrase down, because it is basically the linchpin for why the service looks the way it does.
It really is. In their theology, they believe that when a person dies, they are entirely unconscious.
Right, so they aren't suffering in a purgatory, and they aren't, looking down from heaven either.
Exactly. It is often compared to a deep, dreamless sleep. So the discourse at the funeral isn't about wishing the soul a safe journey or anything like that.
Right.
It's an explanation of God's promise of a future resurrection, where they believe the person will literally be brought back to life on a paradise earth.
Which changes everything about the tone of the room.
What's fascinating here is how that single theological belief acts as a massive psychological buffer for the grieving family.
A buffer. How do you mean?
Well, if you truly believe your loved one is essentially taking a nap in God's memory, safe and without pain, your immediate panic and despair are significantly mitigated.
Wow, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So the elder delivering the talk isn't there just to eulogize. He is there to actively remind the family of that specific theology.
Because that is where the comfort comes from.
Exactly. The primary goal of the service is to provide encouragement, to reinforce that faith, and to offer spiritual clarity during a time when human emotion is typically just chaotic.
I was thinking about this dynamic, and the best analogy I can come up with is changing the lens on a camera.
Oh, I like that.
Well, if a traditional funeral is like using a macro lens, where you are focusing incredibly closely on the granular details of the person's past, their quirks, their career, their hobby.
The micro details.
Right. But the Jehovah's Witness approach is like snapping on a telephoto lens and focusing entirely on the horizon.
Yes, that is a perfect way to put it.
The lens is intentionally focused strictly forward on the theological future and those biblical promises.
That telephoto lens is a great way to look at it. And because the lens is pointed at the horizon, the physical environment of the service doesn't need to be overly focused on the present moment.
Which translates into the actual physical space of the funeral.
Directly. It translates into an overarching theme of intense simplicity. You won't find elaborate rituals, burning incense, or ornate decorations.
The venues themselves really reflect that. From what the sources show, these services are typically held at a kingdom hall, which is their functional, unadorned local place of worship.
Or sometimes at a modest funeral home.
Yeah, or even right at the graveside.
Ah,
They intentionally avoid ceremonial practices that are not explicitly rooted in their interpretation of the Bible.
it just strips away all the external noise.
Mhm.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture of the community, there is a massive practical benefit to this theological simplicity.
The financial side of things.
Yes, the economics of grief in the modern world are just staggering. Traditional funerals can cost tens of thousands of dollars.
Oh, easily. It places an enormous financial burden on families who are already reeling from a loss.
Exactly. But because the Jehovah's Witness ceremony actively discourages all those embellishments and extensive rituals, the cost is naturally minimized.
It essentially removes the socioeconomic pressure.
Completely.
There is no unspoken expectation to prove how much you love the deceased by purchasing the most expensive casket or the most elaborate floral spray.
Right, the playing field is entirely leveled.
Whether the deceased was a wealthy business owner or someone living paycheck to paycheck, the surface looks incredibly similar. The focus remains on the spiritual message, not the material display.
Now, a family might still choose to have a brief viewing or a burial, but the overall approach remains modest by design. The uniformity ensures that no family is ever made to feel inadequate because they couldn't afford a lavish memorial.
Wait, hold on though. Let's look at this from the perspective of someone grieving, say, their partner of 50 years.
Okay, sure.
If there is this standardized general script and they sit down and essentially hear a theological lecture instead of a personalized celebration of those 50 years together,
I see where you're going with this.
doesn't that lack of flexibility feel, I don't know, incredibly cold? If you are grieving a unique individual, doesn't a structured format risk robbing the family of their personal closure?
Well, this raises an important question, and it's honestly the exact reaction most people outside the faith have.
Yeah, it feels counterintuitive to how we normally process grief.
But we have to look at what closure means within their framework. For members of this community, that consistency is actually a feature, not a bug.
A feature.
Yeah. Grief is deeply disorienting. When someone dies, the ground just falls out from under you. By providing a structured, familiar format, the faith provides a safety net.
Oh, I see.
Everyone in that room knows exactly what to expect. There are no surprises. The familiarity itself is what brings the comfort because it allows the grieving family to lean into a structure they've known their entire lives.
Rather than having to invent a new emotional language on the spot.
Exactly.
So the structure absorbs the shock. Instead of the family having to curate an emotional performance, the framework carries them. That makes a lot of sense.
It really does.
And we see that carrying capacity in the other elements of the service too, like the music. You aren't going to hear someone's favorite pop song or a secular ballad.
No, they use what are called kingdom songs.
Right, which are internally produced hymns used specifically by Jehovah's Witnesses. The music is engineered to do the exact same thing as the discourse.
Which is to reinforce those forward-looking themes of hope and faith.
Every single sensory input in the room is curated to support that central message of resurrection.
And that extends to the physical materials guests might receive, too. Families often use resources like the funeral program site to create printed memorial programs.
But even those are simplified, right?
Yes. Even these keepsakes are designed to align with the required dignity of the ceremony. They might have a photo and the person's dates, but the core of the program will feature the specific scriptures being discussed.
So it provides a lasting tribute, but one that completely complements the restrained spiritual tone.
Exactly.
Now, everything we've unpacked so far highlights why this ecosystem is deeply comforting for someone inside the faith.
Right.
But if you ever find yourself invited to one of these services to support a coworker or a friend, it is vital to know that you might experience a bit of culture shock.
Oh, definitely. The biggest hurdle for guests outside the faith is navigating that limited personalization.
Setting expectations is crucial for an outside guest.
It really is. Because the focus is strictly on spiritual instruction, detailed personal eulogies are just absent.
So the elder doesn't talk about the person at all.
Well, the elder might weave in a few details about the individual's faithfulness or their specific qualities, maybe how much they love the ministry or their kindness to the congregation.
But the individual's life story firmly takes a backseat to the scripture.
Completely. If you walk into the Kingdom Hall expecting to hear a chronological timeline of your friend's career achievements and funny college stories, you are going to feel a profound disconnect.
And it is not just the stories that are missing. It's the entire interactive element of traditional mourning.
Right.
There is no open mic. You won't see a parade of extended family members coming up to share their grief. But beyond that, here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh.
There are very specific practices that are entirely absent. Like, there are no prayers for the dead. None.
And let's tie that back to the condition of the dead theology we discussed earlier.
Right, the dreamless sleep.
Exactly. Why are there no prayers for the dead? Because if the deceased is completely unconscious, simply sleeping and waiting for the resurrection, praying for their soul's journey fundamentally contradicts the mechanics of their belief system.
They don't need guidance to the afterlife.
Right, so you don't pray for them, you pray for the comfort of the living family sitting in the front row.
That logical consistency dictates everything. It's the same reason there is no burning of incense, no making the sign of the cross, and no rituals borrowed from other religious traditions.
Yeah, their theology requires a strict avoidance of anything they consider to have pagan origins or unscriptural roots.
Right, they refer to this as avoiding syncretism, the blending of different religious beliefs.
Exactly. So the absence of these rituals isn't an oversight. It's an active, intentional commitment to maintaining theological purity.
Which brings us to the emotional landscape of the room, because that is often the most striking difference for an outside observer.
It really is a huge contrast.
In many cultures, we are conditioned to associate loud, highly visible mourning with the depth of someone's love for the deceased. We almost expect people to fall apart.
We do, yeah.
But in a Jehovah's Witness funeral, the emotional expression is quite different.
Well, mourning is acknowledged as completely natural. I mean, even Jesus wept when his friend Lazarus died, and they cite that frequently.
Right.
But the overall tone is uniquely calm and composed.
And that composure isn't a lack of sadness. It's the direct result of that telephoto lens we talked about.
Yes.
When your entire worldview is heavily weighted toward the absolute certainty of a resurrection, the finality of present grief is softened.
Right. Outward displays of total devastation naturally give way to a more composed atmosphere.
Because they truly believe they're going to see this person again in a perfected state right here on earth.
Exactly. If you genuinely believe the story isn't over, the mechanics of how your body and mind process mourning change entirely.
It fosters a sense of peace and purpose rather than just raw despair.
And maintaining that composure is much easier when you aren't doing it alone.
Oh, right.
This is not a solo family sitting isolated in their grief. The local community, the congregation, plays a massive active role.
The entire network rallies together to offer comfort and highly practical assistance.
Yeah, we hear about the casserole train in traditional mourning, but this is a deeply organized communal effort.
Because everyone in that kingdom hall shares the exact same belief system and the exact same hope for the future.
Yes, so the family is surrounded by people who are entirely aligned with their emotional state. They step in to handle the logistics, organize the meals, and ensure the family can focus entirely on the spiritual comfort being offered.
That communal support is a massive source of strength, and it is coupled with an emphasis on pre-planning, too.
Oh, absolutely. We talked about how the structured nature of the ceremony can be a safety net. Well, individuals manage the details of that net well in advance.
By outlining their preferences ahead of time, right?
Exactly. Decision fatigue is one of the most debilitating side effects of acute grief.
For sure. You just can't process choices.
Right. So by choosing the specific location in advance, selecting the elder they want to deliver the discourse, and picking out the exact scriptures and kingdom songs to be used, the individual does their family an incredible service.
The path is already laid out.
Yeah. The grieving family doesn't have to sit around a table at a funeral home agonizing over what their mother would have wanted. They already know.
Which significantly reduces the friction and stress during those initial painful days.
It really does.
So understanding all of these interconnected pieces, the theology, the structure, the economics, and the community, it helps anyone become a better, more respectful guest.
That is the big takeaway here.
If you understand that the lack of an open mic isn't a lack of love, but a deeply held expression of faith, you remove the culture shock and replace it with empathy.
Yeah, you can appreciate that the elder's discourse isn't a cold lecture, but actually the ultimate form of comfort for that specific room.
You are recognizing their emotional language.
Exactly. When you understand the why behind the simplicity in the scripture, you can be a much better friend to someone in the congregation. You don't need to share their theology to respect the profound comfort it brings them.
Okay, let's pull all of this together. A Jehovah's Witness funeral is fundamentally an exercise in hope, scripture, and simplicity.
Yeah.
It completely replaces the heavy, backward-looking grief
Mm.
and the personalized chronological eulogies of traditional funerals with a calm, highly structured, forward-looking focus.
Beautifully said.
By anchoring the entire experience to the biblical promise of resurrection and supporting it with a tight-knit community, they create an environment designed to provide a very specific kind of spiritual safety net.
You know, if we connect this to the broader spectrum of human psychology, it leaves us with something fascinating to consider.
What's that?
Think about how completely reframing a universally sorrowful event like death alters our neurology. If you treat death not as a permanent loss to be mourned with individual stories, but merely as a temporary pause before a guaranteed reunion.
Temporary pause.
Yeah, it might fundamentally change the very way the human brain processes the trauma of grief itself. When an entire community implicitly agrees that the story isn't over, mourning transforms from an act of saying goodbye into an act of waiting.
Wow. Mourning as an act of waiting. That is a brilliant way to phrase it, and it really drives home the power of that telephoto lens we talked about earlier.
It shifts your whole perspective.
Looking at the horizon changes everything about how you experience the present moment. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep looking through different lenses, and keep asking questions.